The landing ramp hit the red dirt with a heavy metallic thud. Dust swept over the Cathari Vanguard as Commander Vile stepped out, his plasma rifle resting easily against his armored hip. He expected quiet. He assumed the newcomers had slaughtered the civilians. The truth was far more infectious. Kneeling in the trench line, just 50 yards away, shoulder to shoulder with the soft-skinned Terran colonists, were Cathari laborers, his own people, the very caste bred for compliance and physical toil, and they were aiming stolen military rifles squarely at Vile's face. It turned out the galaxy operated on 3 unbreakable rules of war, until Sector 4 shattered them without the Ascendancy even realizing the board had been reset. For 10,000 years, the Orion Ascendancy had functioned on perfect biological certainty. Destiny was encoded in DNA. You were born a commander to think, a warrior to strike, or a laborer to serve. The system was flawless. Then the Terrans arrived. They integrated into the galactic fringe. Quietly enough, they engaged in a standard, entirely unremarkable border skirmish against the Velix Empire. They fought predictably, secured their borders, and initiated a typical expansion, right up against Cathari territory. Nobody thought much of it. The Cathari High Command launched a swift territorial invasion to correct the border lines. It was supposed to be a 3-day operation. Vile remembered the pre-drop briefing. Standard retreat protocols had been issued to Cathari labor worlds near the conflict zone. Keep the assets safe while the warriors cleared the dirt. But the response relays stayed dark. All planetary communications dropped. Millions of workers simply stopped moving on orbital sensors. Now, standing in the stinging wind of the contested colony, Vile watched a Cathari laborer, a being without the adrenal glands required for aggression, flinch as a warning shot cracked over his head. But the laborer didn't run. A Terran infantryman beside him reached out, gripping the laborer's thick, scaled shoulder. Just a squeeze, a grounding touch. Vile felt a cold knot tighten in his secondary stomachs. The laborer exhaled, steadied the rifle against his collarbone, and fired precisely at Vile's vanguard. They were using Ascendancy tactics, seamlessly blended with whatever chaotic, erratic maneuvers the Terrans favored. The crossfire was brutal. Plasma bolts scorched the air. Frost melted on Vile's visor. He dropped to one knee behind a transport strut, his mind fracturing as he tried to process the impossible geometry of the battlefield. It wasn't the stolen weapons that paralyzed the Cathari forces. It was the way the Terrans looked at the laborers, not as tools, not as biological assets. They moved as a single breathing unit, bound by something entirely foreign to the Ascendancy. A Terran medic sprinted across the open ground, diving into the dirt to drag a wounded Cathari worker behind a barricade. Vile watched the human press their bare, fragile hands against the alien's bleeding scales, shouting words he couldn't translate. In a universe defined by rigid purpose, adaptability was the ultimate apex predator. The Ascendancy had just walked directly into its jaws. Vile survived the extraction, but the war ended the moment his boots left that red dirt. He stood rigid in the sterile, glaring light of the high command chamber. The intelligence audit scrolled endlessly across glass displays. Ascendancy biologists had studied the Terran forces, sequenced their genome, and mapped their societal flow. Analysts stared at the readouts, their mandibles clicking in disturbed, erratic rhythms. The humans had no fixed castes. A Terran could haul heavy cargo, calibrate a hyperdrive, and fire a kinetic rifle, all within the same solar cycle. It was biological anarchy. They were not a specialized species. They were aggressively, radically adaptable. The Ascendancy High Command did the only thing it could compute. They halted. You cannot fight an ideological virus with orbital strikes. A long, agonizing stretch of peace settled over the sector. But the Terrans didn't sit still behind their borders. They poured out. Merchant ships, civilian freighters, cultural ambassadors saturated neighboring star systems. They docked in Cathari supply stations and Velix refueling depots. They brought grain, crude machine parts, and loud, chaotic music. They sat on the cold metal floors of loading bays with alien laborers, sharing synthetic rations and passing stories of a place where a worker could decide to be a leader. It turned out to conquer an empire, you don't declare war, you simply threaten them with a lasting peace. The Xerian hegemony, the oldest and most brutal military bloc in the quadrant, saw the rot spreading through their lower castes. They panicked. High Command formally declared war on the Terran systems, activating 1 billion genetically modified warriors. The mobilization shook orbital docks. But when the final command to fire on Terran cultural hubs was given, the transmission was met with dead air. On the bridge of the Xerian flagship, the Prime Commander watched his elite vanguard. The warriors held their heavy plasma cannons, looking down at the targeted worlds where they had traded, spoken with Terran engineers, learned the alien concept of personal choice. Slowly, the lead warrior lowered his weapon. The rest of the battalion followed. The heavy thud of rifles hitting the deck echoed through the ship. They didn't shout. They didn't strike their commanders. They simply unsealed their armor, letting thick chest plates crash to the floor, openly refusing the command. The contagion was absolute. It didn't take centuries for the galaxy to fall. It took less than a single generation. Terran sociocultural frameworks bled through the sector, completely overriding the traditional structures of surrounding civilizations. The rigid, millennia-old galactic caste system systematically collapsed across all known space. Millions of laborers walked away from their stations. Commanders stood in empty halls, broadcasting orders to people who no longer listened. The Ascendancy didn't burn. It simply surrendered, slipping into a permanent, unbreakable era of forced pacification under Terran cultural dominance. Years later, Vile retired his armor. He bought a small patch of land near a Terran Cathari colony. He spent his days watching the humans, soft-skinned, unpredictable creatures who had broken the universe just by existing. He watched a human child hand a piece of fruit to a Cathari once bred only to carry heavy loads. And Vile finally understood. The Terrans hadn't defeated the Ascendancy. Please follow my channel for more videos. One click from you can change my life.